What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my rankings for all of the CRPGs that I have reviewed. I was recently talking about the Infinity Engine games, and a couple of people in those videos asked me to rank them, but I honestly felt that was a little too easy since there's only 5 of those games. However, what I thought would be fun was doing rankings for every CRPG I've played, and more specifically reviewed. There's a few that I've played that aren't on this list because I don't have reviews for them. But to that end, this is a CRPG-focused channel, and while I do cover RPGs at large, I tend to specialize a bit in CRPGs, and as such, I've reviewed many of them. Roughly 40, actually. Which includes most of the major ones. There are a few major ones I haven't gotten to yet, and then there are a ton of niche games that I haven't touched at all, but will likely get to at some point. So while this is hardly a list of every CRPG ever, it is nonetheless a lot of them. So let's get to these rankings, which I'm sure everyone will love and no one will argue with me about. But if you find yourself disagreeing with the rankings, keep in mind this is mostly just my personal opinions, and it's really not that serious. Now, starting at the very bottom of the list, we have Lionheart, Legacy of the Crusader. Interesting game. The opening of it is very, very strong. And it is a sort of alternate history real world where magic was brought into the world during the Crusades, and the game handles this very, very well. The opening sees you in Barcelona with tons of different options between factions and choices and ways to approach your build. However, unfortunately, the game frankly isn't finished. The last half of it turns into more of an ARPG and is very lackluster, hence it's on the bottom of the list. Next up, we have Elex 2. I enjoy the first Elex a great deal. It's also on this list, but Elex 2 was very underwhelming. They hardly changed anything at all from Elex 1. In some ways it looks a little worse, and frankly the changes they did make weren't very substantial. Like the combat feels a little better and you can do more stuff with the jetpack, but beyond that the game is almost identical outside of like new enemies to fight, and I found it very underwhelming. So while I did enjoy it because I really like the idea of Elex and thus more of that isn't necessarily bad, it's very underwhelming compared to the first game. Then we have Shadowrun Returns. I really enjoy the Shadowrun setting, and Shadowrun Returns isn't bad, it's simply that it's more of a tech demo for the later games and what was possible. Shadowrun as a setting tends to focus on things like heists and getting in and out of places, so it has this sort of mission structure that lends itself very naturally to this game. However, Returns is very short. It's more like an introduction to the setting. You're looking at like maybe 7 to 8 hours, give or take a little bit, for a full run through of the first game here. And it's definitely a great place to start if you're curious about the game and the setting, but it's definitely not Dragonfall or Hong Kong, which followed. Then we have Greedfall. Greedfall was good, but not great. This is the sort of colonial fantasy from Spiders, who made things like Technomancer and more recently Steel Rising. But it has a very similar structure to old BioWare RPGs like the KOTOR series, for instance. However, it kind of falls flat in being memorable. It's good, but a lot of it tends to turn into a repetitive slog, especially towards the end where you're running through the same areas, fighting the same stuff with the same methods, and it could use a little variety. However, beyond that, it's still a pretty good game with some choices, consequences, things like that, and I'm excited for Greedfall 2 to see what it can learn from its predecessor. Then we have Encased. Encased is a Fallout-like that takes place in an alternative history US where they find the Dome, which is a sort of precursor society's ancient ruins that has all sorts of relics for you to find. However, people can go in, but they can't come out. The Dome, as it's called, will not let organic beings leave once they've entered. And after some event kind of shakes up the Dome and its communications, it turns into a sort of wasteland where you have to survive against things like radiation, anomalies, that type of thing. It's overall very good, a lot of choices, a lot of ways to play through the game, but it does lack a bit of that AAA polish. Some of it feels very clunky, and the writing can feel a little average because it is, again, a Fallout-like, and we've seen a lot of those. Then we have Age of Decadence. Age of Decadence is good, but it's very niche. It appeals to a relatively small percentage of players, if you will. Even if you like CRPGs, there's no guarantee you'll like Age of Decadence. The combat especially tends to be pretty polarizing. However, there are nonetheless a ton of choices and consequences down to who you start the game as, factions you can align yourself with. The game isn't afraid to let you fail either, but there's also things like pacifist routes, etc. So you have options, but mostly it's down lower on the list simply because, again, it's a very niche game for a niche audience. But then we have Solasta, Crown of the Majesty. sister. Solasta is an interesting one because it is a fantastic simulator of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. If you only care about the combat from that game and want to play it in a video game setting, Solasta is fantastic for that. Where it falls flat is the base campaign is a little lackluster, and obviously the graphics could be better. If you want to play some 5th edition pretty close to rules as written in video games, it's definitely the way to go. Combine that with the campaign editor and stuff that they have in-game, and you can make your own stuff and have a pretty good time. Next up, we have Black Geyser. This is a Baldur's Gate inspired title from Grape Ocean Studios, and it wears its Baldur's Gate inspiration pretty heavy on the sleeve. You can also see some elements of the more recent Pillars series, but in tying itself so closely to those types of games, it kind of fails to stand out in a lot of ways. It's certainly not bad though, and in fact, it has an interesting greed mechanic, where depending on your character's either righteousness or kind of greedy attitude, the things you choose to do, the world will respond, and the world has a greed level, which can affect how NPCs react to you, how shops and towns are holding up, that type of stuff, and a lot of things can change based on the world's greed level, which I thought was a pretty cool mechanic. Then we have Icewind Dale 1. I really enjoy Icewind Dale, but it is primarily an advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat simulator. It is entirely focused on dungeon crawling and that aspect of it. There's a little bit of interactivity based on things like your class, etc., but the story is very straightforward and you jump from one dungeon to the next. So, as someone like myself who enjoys the advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat and the Infinity Engine games, it's a lot of fun, but if you want more, it just doesn't have it. Then we have Atom RPG, another Fallout-inspired title. This one is a little more on the nose in terms of what Fallout was. It recreates things like the UI with a more modern look, and tries to give you as many options as possible. It's also very difficult to break the main story. There's tons of ways to get around to it. You can kill plot important characters, that type of stuff. So tons of choices and consequence, very Fallout. However, like other games on this list, it lacks a bit of that AAA polish, and as such, it's a pretty clunky experience, which does drag it down a bit. Next up, we have Torment, Tides of Numenera. Obviously inspired by Planescape Torment. It's very heavy on the story, and as such, it's very, very text heavy. So if that's not your jam, this one's probably not for you. But if you enjoy that kind of thing, I think it's a great adventure that will see you running through all sorts of truly bizarre settings, because the game takes place on Earth, but 1 billion years later, and things have changed quite a bit. That said though, if you're not into the narrative of this game, you likely won't enjoy the rest of it, as the RPG mechanics are relatively light, and I think there's only like a dozen combat encounters throughout the entire game, so combat really is not the focus here. Personally, though, I did really enjoy sort of the bizarre fantasy settings. I thought it had a lot of cool stuff going for it in that regard, and I enjoyed the story, but it does end a bit abruptly. Then we have Pathfinder Kingmaker. I enjoy Pathfinder Kingmaker, however, it has a lot of faults primarily around the kingdom management for me personally, and in some ways it's more frustrating than it is fun, which is why it is so low on the list. But nonetheless, I really enjoy Pathfinder. If you watch the channel at all, I covered this and Wrath of the Righteous pretty extensively. Big fan of Pathfinder. If you want to play Pathfinder Kingmaker, you kind of have to expect a little bit of frustration if you want to get through it relatively calmly, let's say. But much like Wrath of the Righteous, great character creation system, tons of options to roleplay your character. You get to manage a kingdom, which in theory is pretty cool. The execution's a little lackluster. Has a lot of things going for it. Then we have Fallout 1. Definitely a classic, and it spawned an entire franchise with some pretty deep lore. Now, honestly, all of the Fallout games are relatively low on the list for me. I'm not wild about Fallout. I do enjoy a lot of the games, but a lot of the more nuanced stuff with the lore, things like that, don't speak to me as much as other games do. But Fallout 1 in particular is a lot of fun. I especially loved the story and the stuff with the super mutants and the master towards the end of it. And thanks to a bit of an update to the game that allows it to be played in things like modern resolutions, for instance, it's still very playable to this day. And it is a pretty good experience if you're willing to play around with some of that clunkier aged mechanics. Then we have Fallout 2. Fallout 2 is a bit different from Fallout 1. I would say it takes itself a tiny bit less seriously. There's tons of pop culture references, fourth wall breaking, that type of stuff. And it really feels like this is the game where the Fallout brand kind of spawned into existence, whereas Fallout 1 was a bit more serious and on the nose. Fallout 2 feels a bit more like what Fallout is today. Combined Combine that with better combat, more options, frankly, and a very interesting story that sees you up against the Enclave, and you can definitely have a lot of fun with it, as evidenced by the Fallout franchise's explosion in popularity. But I think it might surprise you to learn that honestly, even the original 2 games, 1 and 2, still hold up very, very well. But then we have Fallout New Vegas, largely considered the best of the Fallout games. Fallout New Vegas really nails choice and consequence and exploring a setting. I also enjoyed that it kind of stepped away from the more radiation and gritty urban environments that we've seen a lot of up to that point and took it back to the West Coast. And it leans more heavily on the lore established in Fallout 1 and 2 and the locations, that type of stuff, because again, they're all kind of around that same western area. But Fallout New Vegas really nails choice and consequence. The world feels interesting and more realistic, like sometimes you go into a gas station and it's just a gas station. There's not some hidden dungeon beneath it. But while I'm not huge on Fallout, New Vegas does really nail its world building, and it's a lot of fun as a result, especially when you start siding with different factions. But that brings us to the next one, and that is Icewind Dale 2. I reviewed this one very recently, and I think it's an improvement from the original Icewind Dale in just about every way, but especially the story. The story is fantastic. It has a lot of ambiguity to it about who's right. Are the people you're fighting even really wrong in their goals, even if they are doing some pretty evil things to attain them? And while Icewind Dale had a little bit of reactivity to things like your class, etc., I think Icewind Dale 2 does a lot better job of it, and thus it feels more reactive in the RPG sense as a result. However, much like Icewind Dale, very dungeon crawler focused game, not a ton of story. It is my understanding there was an evil route that ultimately got cut, and if that had been there, I think it would have been a lot better overall. But still, a very fun, enjoyable experience, though it doesn't exactly push the envelope as far as CRPGs are concerned. Next up, we have Temple of Elemental Evil, Troika's take on a CRPG based on the Temple of Elemental Evil module, which is considered the grandfather of dungeon crawlers, if you will. But beyond that, pretty interesting game. It takes on Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition rules, which is relatively rare as far as the games go, which is pretty neat. And combine that with a module that holds up very well to this day, that sees you with many options through the game, even an evil route or siding with various factions within the Temple of Elemental Evil. And you've got some choices. It's definitely a classic, but like a lot of these games, especially the older ones, tends to be a bit on the clunkier side. And in fact, this one is basically unplayable without a few mods, such as Temple Plus and Circle of 8. But if you're willing to deal with that, it's a fantastic experience that I enjoyed quite a bit. Then we have Jade Empire, a very unique RPG from BioWare, though this one is kind of a CRPG, but barely, in my opinion. This is a game where you can really see BioWare starting to trim down the RPG mechanics of their games and focus more on the action. And surprisingly, I think for Jade Empire, a lot of that worked very, very well in the context of this one game. But beyond that, you get a ton of martial art fighting styles. There's a sort of karma system with you being either good or evil, which can then influence various other parts of the game. And overall, it's a very enjoyable experience that has a lot of great moments. And it's really a shame we never got a second one. But then we have Neverwinter. Neverwinter's a tough one to put on a list like this because Neverwinter is as much a platform for content as it is an actual game. So if you're unaware, Neverwinter Nights does have a proper plot or a main campaign, if you will. It is also a tool set that allows for user-generated content. And thanks to a recent enhanced edition, a lot of that is still going very strongly to this day. However, depending on which of those modules you want to play and talk about, they're kind of all over the place in terms of quality. And let's be honest, the graphics are kind of getting on. But if you're willing to look beyond that, you can have a lot of fun in Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition rule set, which the game largely manages for you, and you can focus on a more combat-oriented experience if you want, but thankfully the modules kind of have a little bit of everything in terms of the experience you want. Which then brings me to Neverwinter Nights 2. While the tool set and the content creation for this one never caught on quite as much, I really enjoyed the main campaign, and one of its expansions, Mask of the Betrayer, actually is largely considered one of the best expansions ever made, and with good reason. It's very, very good. However, the main story ends pretty abruptly in a terrible way. However, Mask of the Betrayer kind of undoes a lot of that, if you will, but there was only so much they could do. For Neverwinter Nights 2, I would definitely recommend running through the main campaign in Mask of the Betrayer, but even again here, there's tons of modules, etc. to look at and play through, which all kind of have their own quality, if you will. Next up, we have Shadowrun Hong Kong, the latest in the Shadowrun series. Hong Kong is great from a gameplay perspective. They made a lot of improvements to the flow and combat of the Shadowrun series. However, it is a little less open for your character. You play more of a set character with a set background, so they kind of trimmed in some of the roleplay options, which is hit or miss, but the gameplay is very much so improved. But Shadowrun also launched with a tool set that people have recreated the previous Shadowrun games in, so you can play the older Shadowrun games in this newer sort of gameplay system and have a really good experience as a result. Nonetheless, though, I like Shadowrun Hong Kong a lot. It has some great characters with some memorable side missions, if you will, involving those companions, and I had a lot of fun. Then we have Arcanum. This is another game that you really need mods to play. If you're not using the unofficial patch, you're going to have a very bad time. But Arcanum is a fantastic game with a lot of really cool ideas that were not executed especially well. And this really shows with the character creation. Your character creation is just all over the place. And you'll likely have to burn through a few characters before you create a character that is decent, let alone can actually finish the game. And because of that, it still ranks a little bit lower on the list, but I did love the setting, the sort of steampunk Magick setting, and I think they absolutely nailed it in that regard, which is why Arcanum is so beloved and still talked about to this day. Next up, we have Dragon Age Origins. I kind of notoriously don't like Origins as much as most people. Most people regard it as amazing, and I think that's a little bit overselling it. I think it's very good, but I don't think it's as amazing as people make it out to be. But nonetheless, it is still an incredibly good game that, of course, spawned the Dragon Age series. While people like Dragon Age for different things, personally, I love the lore, especially the stuff around the Blight and the Grey Wardens, and seeing that in this one video game here is a lot of fun, and easily my favorite part. And combine that with characters that are, for the most part, pretty well written, and all the choices you can make, and you've got a great experience. But that brings us to our next one, and that is KOTOR 1. This is, of course, the Star Wars CRPG. And like a lot of people, I'm a really big fan of Star Wars, and unfortunately, there are not a great amount of amazing video games in that regard, especially if you prefer RPGs. But some of the best are in the form of KOTOR 1 and 2. But KOTOR 1, I think, pales in comparison to the next one on the list, and that is KOTOR 2. KOTOR 2 really kind of expands and I think does a better job interpreting a lot of the Star Wars universe than the first game does. Because KOTOR 2, it kind of feels like they took some leeway to tell a story that was not already being told elsewhere. For instance, painting the Jedi as, maybe not actually as great as they make themselves out to be, and in some cases, just woefully incompetent. Combine that with some gameplay improvements, and I really enjoyed KOTOR 2. If the entrance to the game on Paragus was a little bit better, I think it would have been even higher on this list, but the first part of the game on Paragus, the sort of tutorial, is rough. It is very long and it is very boring. And then we have Elex. Now, I'll be the first person to tell you Elex probably has no business being this high up on a rankings list, but it is a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine and I kind of love it. It's a very janky AA experience, and I think there's a lot of things about it that are more frustrating than they really should be, but looking at the game as a whole, it is just a really fun experience where you can choose and kind of slowly build up your character Jax over the course of it to either use magic or more modern day weapons, and the story itself is really interesting where a meteor hit the planet, which brought us the resource Elex, which is used to power all sorts of technology and things, and it's just incredibly interesting, and the gameplay is janky, but somehow also really fun once you get the hang of it. And I'll be the first person, again, to tell you that it's probably not really a great game, but I love it, and thus it's pretty high on the list. But that brings us to the next one, and that is Planescape Torment. I really enjoy Planescape Torment, but the best thing about it, as many people will tell you, is the story. The story is phenomenal. And with the Enhanced Edition, it's a very accessible game. The rest of the gameplay tends to be pretty lackluster, so while I enjoyed the story enough to push it pretty high on this list, it does kind of still fall a little flat on the gameplay side. A lot of it just isn't very fun in that regard. And that's definitely where the game shows its age the most, is things like the combat and actually running around trying to solve things can be very, very clunky. But if you're willing to look past that, the story is amazing. And speaking of amazing stories, then we have Disco Elysium. Definitely a game with a heavy emphasis on the narrative. Most of it is reading and interacting with things. However, Disco Elysium is pretty widely considered an amazing game, and for good reason, as a lot of the interactions and the sort of bizarre stuff that can happen and the character themselves and the writing is really top-notch stuff. Also, the game does a good job of giving you interesting failure, if you will. By which I mean when you fail something, sometimes that just leads to something more interesting happening and isn't necessarily a reason to just reload until you succeed, which I thought was a nice touch. It's definitely not all over the game. There are some areas where if you fail, you just fail. But for the most part, I think they did a great job with the writing and keeping a narrative that is interesting and trying to give people a reason to keep playing rather than just reloading. But then we have Shadowrun Dragonfall. Dragonfall is my favorite of all the Shadowrun games. I think the companions especially are the highlight. It has some really interesting companions that are very well thought out with interesting side missions. And the actual story of the game is pretty interesting as well, as it covers the dragons, as you might imagine, of the Shadowrun series, which are much more interesting than they tend to typically be in a lot of these types of settings. But I think Shadowrun Dragonfall really nailed what Shadowrun should be. But then next up we have Expeditions Rome. I'm a huge fan of Expeditions Rome. As a game that is supposed to be more of a tactical RPG, I think it really surprised me to find out that it is in fact more of a CRPG. You play as a sort of stand-in for Julius Caesar, so instead of Julius Caesar, it's you, and you can kind of recreate some of the historical decisions he made, or you can kind of go your own way. And the game responds and reacts to that, all with a nice heaping of tactical combat that is much more interesting than swordsmen and archers would imply. But it's a great game with tons of choice and consequence, very, very solid combat, and it is remarkably good. If you haven't played it, you should definitely check it out. Then we have Wasteland 3. I'm a big fan of Wasteland 3. I do think the content tends to be a bit front-loaded in the first couple of areas, Colorado Springs and the Bazaar, because once you get out of those areas, there's really not that much left on the world map to explore outside of a handful of areas that are really like a one-and-done mission type of place. But I enjoyed the combat, I enjoyed all of the weapons, I enjoyed the sort of in-person camera stuff that happens when you're talking to certain villains, and Wasteland 3 is definitely one of the better modern-day CRPGs, and people should check it out. But that brings me to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, one of my favorites. Of course, putting you in the role of a vampire in the World of Darkness setting, specifically Vampire the Masquerade. Now, this is another one that you should really play with the unofficial patch. It fixes most of the issues, and while you can beat the game without the patch, it's not really a good experience. The patch really makes this game infinitely more playable. We can pick one of many vampire clans to play as, which all have their own different vampire powers, which can then influence how you can approach various quests, which usually have multiple routes to play through them. There's several different endings. It's a great game that was well ahead of its time, and it's a shame it released as such a buggy mess on, I believe, the same day as Half-Life 2, actually, which is a really poor decision, at least in hindsight. But that brings us to the next one, and that is Baldur's Gate 2. One of the greats as far as CRPGs go. A lot of people love Irenicus, the villain. However, I'm a little less sold on BG2 compared to BG1. The second one has emphasis on higher level combat, which with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is the edition the game uses, I think a lot of the higher level combat isn't that good. A lot of it boils down to like stripping down defenses and then actually attacking, and I just enjoy it less. So naturally, the next one on the list is Baldur's Gate 1. While I would say it's a bit more narrow in scope than Baldur's Gate 2, and some of it is definitely a little more clunky, overall I enjoy the story and the experience more for Baldur's Gate 1, because again, it focuses on that lower level Advanced Dungeons & Dragons combat, which I think is a little bit more interesting to engage with, and it doesn't get so overcomplicated with having to use, again, just various spells to debuff enemies, to pull their protections off, and as such, I just prefer the first game. But then we have UnderRail. UnderRail is a bit niche with a notorious difficulty. I would tell you though, it's not as difficult as people make it out to be, and there are more options in terms of builds than you probably think. However, UnderRail is a game that will let you fail, and as such, there is a bit of a learning curve to a lot of it, and if you're not willing to engage with that, you're likely not going to have a good time, because again, UnderRail is a bit of a niche experience, but there are tons of options for building your character and then using that character to traverse the UnderRail, if you will. And if you're willing to put the time in, UnderRail can be a ton of fun. But that brings us to our next entry, and this is Tyranny. Tyranny is one of the CRPGs from Obsidian. It released in between Pillars of Eternity 1 and Pillars of Eternity 2. Now, Tyranny is pretty classic Obsidian, honestly. There's like 4 major paths through the game, so that gives it quite a bit of replayability. But I think what's really interesting about Tyranny is the world itself. And unfortunately, this is a game we've never gotten a sequel for, so I doubt we'll ever see any more of it. But it's a game where evil has largely won, and a lot of the game comes down to choosing between the lesser evil, if you will, or just embracing being evil. However, this is done in a very lawful evil sort of way, which you don't see a ton of in video games. So, pretty interesting game, you should definitely check it out. But that brings me to Pillars of Eternity 1. One of the games credited with the sort of CRPG revival in the early 2010s, also by Obsidian, and I really enjoy it largely because of the lore. The stuff around the wheel and the Watchers and just animancy and everything around the souls is just very interesting to me conceptually. Now, where Pillars of Eternity 1 does fall a bit flat, however, is the story can be a bit dull at times, and in terms of the character creation, because this game actually uses its own system for leveling and role-playing and everything, there's no way to like look up where to go, or at least there wasn't at the time, in terms of the actual character building, because as you level up, you don't really know what skills you're going to get, which can make it hard to build a class, and then you got to use that effectively. And this is a problem largely fixed by the next game, Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. Deadfire really expanded on everything from the first game, and Pillars of Eternity 2 is one of my favorite games overall. The ending specifically, and kind of the story overall, is a bit underwhelming. I think the rest of the game is fantastic, tons of options for building your character, exploring the archipelago, and there's just a lot of cool stuff going on, except the main story, interestingly enough, which is a problem when that's kind of like your main draw. But the ending especially is kind of just over in the blink of an eye, and the main game, if you will, is really the side content, which is kind of a strange way to go, I suppose. But nonetheless, a game I love pretty much everything else about. And then, second to last, we have Divinity Original Sin 2. This channel used to cover Divinity lore pretty extensively, but I kind of just ran out of things to talk about, and that all started because I played Original Sin 2. And I loved it so much, I wanted to know everything there was to know about the Divinity universe. And Original Sin 2 is very, very good. However, I would say Original Sin 2 does reactivity incredibly well. Like everything you're doing, the game tends to have something or some way of reacting to. However, when you look at the actual story, it's pretty linear. So while there are a ton of choices, there really aren't a lot of consequences, which is honestly kind of an interesting way to go. But the rest of the game is so fun and interactive that it's still one of my favorites and is beaten out only by the number 1 on this list, which everyone already knew was coming, and that is Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. I love that game. Obviously, I love Pathfinder. I really enjoy the character creation options, even if some of it is a little redundant. But you take all of those character building options and combine them with the mythic paths, which can create their own kind of interesting ways through the game, which change the experience quite a bit. And you have an insanely replayable RPG that is hands down one of my favorites and likely will be for quite some time. But that is all of the CRPGs I have reviewed ranked. By all means, let me know what you think about my rankings down below. Again, I'm sure everyone will love them and no one will disagree. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.